You should be familiar with using HTML, and you should be aware of using semantic HTML whenever possible. This is always the best way for you to develop websites. There is, however, a part of HTML called ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. Now, ARIA is not a true programming language, but it's a set of attributes that you can add to HTML elements to increase their accessibility. These attributes communicate role, state, and property to assistive technologies via accessible APIs found in modern browsers. The communication happens through something called the accessibility tree. When we're trying to build accessible websites, ARIA can definitely assist in making HTML more meaningful, especially to screen readers. Assistive technologies are used to convert content into an alternative format, such as Braille or text-to-speech. ARIA on its own doesn't change an element's functionality or visual appearance. That means that only assistive technology users will notice the difference between a digital product with ARIA and one without it. That also means that developers alone are responsible for making the appropriate code and styling changes to make an element as accessible as possible. The three main features of ARIA are roles, properties, and states and values. While all three elements of ARIA can be used in one line of code, it's not required and often not necessary. Instead, layer ARIA roles, properties, and states and/or values until you've accomplished your final accessibility goal. Correctly incorporating ARIA into your code base ensures that assistive technology users will have all of the information that they need to use your website, app, or any other digital product successfully and equitably. When you're using HTML5, the use of ARIA may not be as critical. When the browser supports an HTML tag with an implicit role with an ARIA equivalent, there's usually no need to add ARIA to the element. However, ARIA still includes many roles, states, and properties that aren't available in any version of HTML. These attributes remain useful for now. When we think about how to use ARIA, here are some basic ARIA rules that you should keep in mind. The first is don't use ARIA. I know this sounds a little counterintuitive, but don't use it unless you absolutely have to. Adding ARIA to an element does not inherently make it more accessible. This is commonly due to improper use of ARIA attributes. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. ARIA is required when an HTML element doesn't have accessibility support. This could be because the design doesn't allow for a specific HTML element, or the wanted feature or behavior just isn't available in HTML. These situations tend to be a little bit more uncommon. Instead of using an anchor element with a role of button, it's better just to use a button element, and then we don't need the role attribute. The second rule is don't add unnecessary ARIA to HTML. In most circumstances, HTML elements work well right out of the box, and you don't need to add any additional ARIA to them. Sometimes when you overuse ARIA, you'll actually have to add additional code to make the elements functional in the case of interactive elements. Here's some examples of things you don't want to do. Instead of adding an H1 element with a role of heading, just use an H1 element. Instead of using a nav with a role of nav, simply use the nav element. Or in certain situations where you have to use a div element instead of a nav element, then the role attribute equal to nav would be appropriate. So by itself, the HTML5 element of nav defines that area as being navigation. If you're using some generic element like div to create your navigation, then the ARIA role of nav attribute would be appropriate. It's always better to do less work and have better performing code when you use the native HTML elements as they're intended. You always need to add keyboard support. All interactive and not disabled ARIA controls must be keyboard accessible. You can add a tab index of 0 to any element that needs a focus that doesn't normally receive keyboard focus. An example of this would be using a span element with a role of button. By default, it's not going to take on any sort of focus. So what we would want to use is we would want to add a tab index, and instead of setting it to 1, we'd want to set it to 0. When we use a tab index that's greater than 0, it jumps the element to the front of the natural tab order. If there are multiple elements with a tab index that's greater than 0, the tab order starts from the lowest value greater than 0 and works its way up. Using a tab index that's greater than 0 is considered an anti-pattern because screen readers navigate the page in the DOM order, not the tab order. So if you need an element to come sooner in the tab order, you should move it to an earlier spot in the DOM. If you use a negative value, it's going to remove the element from the natural tab order. These elements will not be focused by default. You would need to add some additional JavaScript in order for the elements to have focus. You never want to hide focusable elements. So we want to avoid using ARIA attributes such as role equals presentation or ARIA-hidden equals true to elements that need to have focus, including elements that have the tab index of 0. When we add these roles or states to elements, it sends a message to the assistive technology that these elements are not important and they'll actually skip over them. This can lead to confusion and disrupt users attempting to interact with those elements. So instead of using a button with an ARIA hidden of true, I just want to use a generic button. Finally, we always want to use accessible names for any sort of interactive element. The purpose of an interactive element needs to be conveyed to a user before they know how to interact with it. So ensure that all elements have an accessible name for people that use assistive technology devices. Accessible names can be the content surrounded by the element, like a text node, or they can actually be other attributes, such as the alt attribute. So here are some examples. If I just have a generic anchor link, you can see that the plain text between the link tags, the text node, is what is going to give the accessible name. If I have an image inside of an anchor element, the alt element is what's going to give the accessible name. So there's no need for me to use any special ARIA code here because the accessible names are built into the regular HTML. Hopefully this has given you a little bit of an overview on the basics of ARIA. Up next, we'll look at how we can use ARIA to improve our web pages for accessibility.